There are days that are not measured in hours. They are measured in ammunition, in water, in blood, and they are measured in the sound of engines. They said the landing zone was closed. They said it was suicide, a graveyard of elephant grass and shattered trees where the very air had turned to lead. The order was clear. No helicopters in, no helicopters out. But 500 men were trapped inside that graveyard, and their survival would depend on one pilot. One man who heard the order, looked at the smoke, and chose to fly anyway. This is the story of that day. November 14th, 1965, the Ia Drang Valley. The Vietnamese called it the Valley of Death. The men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, trapped at a clearing they called Landing Zone X-Ray, were beginning to understand why. This was the day the war changed. This was the day the helicopter, and the men who flew it, would be tested not by manuals, but by fire. It was a test of machinery, but it was a testament of loyalty. The men on the ground had been fighting for their lives since the first shots rang out. They were led by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, a man whose presence was a lifeline, but even he knew the math. They were surrounded, outnumbered, perhaps 10 to 1. The North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, were disciplined, relentless, and they were closing in. The perimeter was shrinking. The noise was a physical wall. The constant, deafening crackle of AK-47s, the heavier thump of enemy mortars, and the answering, desperate rip of American M16s. But the most terrifying sound was the one that wasn't there. Silence from the sky. The fight had become primal. It was fought with bayonets in the tall grass. It was fought with fists in the dust. And the sun? The Vietnamese sun was an enemy all its own. 100 degrees, humid, suffocating. It baked the blood into the red dirt. It pulled the last drop of moisture from the men. Canteens were empty. Lips were cracked and bleeding. The radio operators screamed for support, for supplies, for anything. But the most desperate calls were for the wounded. They lay in rows behind the shallow command post, a terrible, growing line of quiet courage and agonizing patience. They needed plasma. They needed bandages. More than anything, they needed out. The medics were performing miracles with nothing. And the man who could bring them that nothing, that everything, was Major Bruce Crandall. Code name, Snake. Crandall was the commander of A Company, 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion. He was not a gunship pilot. He flew a Slick, the UH-1 Huey. We must understand this machine, for on this day, it was more than a machine. The Huey was not a dragon built for war. It was a dragonfly. It was thin-skinned aluminum, a complex heart of a single Lycoming turbine, and a main rotor that beat the air with that iconic, soul-shaking thwop, thwop, thwop. It was a utility truck, a bus, a beast of burden. It was designed to carry troops to a fight, not to fly into the heart of one. Its only defense was 2 door gunners with M60 machine guns and the skill of the man at the controls. To fly a Huey low and slow into a hot landing zone was not just dangerous. It was an invitation to death. If you were there, you'd never forget that sound. You'd never forget the silhouette of that machine against a gray sky, because it was the sound of a gamble, the sound that meant you had a chance. The call had gone out. Broken arrow. It was the phrase no one ever wanted to hear. It meant an American unit was being overrun. It was a call for every available aircraft in Vietnam to drop everything and come to the rescue. The sky above X-ray had filled with fighters. Sky Raiders and Phantoms rolled in, dropping napalm and bombs, sometimes dangerously close to the American lines. The ground shook. The world turned to fire and smoke. The NVA assault was broken for a moment, but the fire on the ground had also set the air on fire. The landing zone was a vortex of shrapnel, tracers, and smoke so thick it choked the turbines. The official medevac pilots, the dust-off crews, flew in. They were brave men, but their red-crossed ships were magnets for bullets. One was hit, limped away. Another was badly damaged. The word came down from high command. Sharp, and absolute. The LZ is closed. The risk was too high. No more helicopters would be sent. The 500 men on the ground were, officially, on their own. Hal Moore's voice came over the radio, a voice strained by smoke and command. He wasn't asking for rescue. He was begging for supplies. We need water. We need ammunition. We need to get these wounded men out. We are dying down here. Bruce Crandall sat in his Huey, orbiting at a safe distance, listening. He looked at the column of black smoke that marked the center of X-ray. He looked at the other helicopters in his flight, holding pattern, waiting for an order that would not come. An order is a line drawn in the sand, a commander's word, a regulation. But brotherhood is a line drawn in blood. Crandall saw his men on the ground, the 7th Cavalry, his cavalry. He had put them there. He turned to his wingman, Captain Ed Too Tall Freeman. The decision was not made with a speech. It was made with a look. Crandall keyed his microphone. He spoke to his crew chief, to his gunners. He told them what he was going to do. He told them they did not have to go. Not one man moved from his station. Crandall keyed his radio again, this time to flight operations. We're going in. The reply was frantic. The LZ is closed, Snake. You are not cleared. Crandall's answer would define the day. I'm going in anyway. He turned his unarmed, thin-skinned utility helicopter toward the center of hell. Freeman tucked his ship in tight on Crandall's wing. They were volunteers, flying into a battle that professional air support had just declared unwinnable. The descent was a controlled fall. The air was alive. Green-gray tracers, the color of NVA ammunition, reached up for them. They looked slow, almost lazy, until they snapped past the cockpit windscreen with a sound like cracking ice. The door gunners opened up, their M60s hammering, trying to suppress the flashes in the trees. The Huey was not armored. Every round that missed the pilot by inches was a matter of luck. Every round that didn't miss tore through the aluminum fuselage with a sound like a hammer hitting a tin roof. Crandall didn't flinch. His hands were steady on the cyclic, his feet on the anti-torque pedals. He was wrestling a 2-ton machine through a hurricane of his own making. He ignored the warning lights. He ignored the noise. He focused on one thing, a patch of ground near Hal Moore's command post. He brought the Huey down, not gently, but firmly, slamming the skids into the dirt. The world exploded. For the men on the ground, the sound of those blades was a resurrection. It was the most beautiful noise they had ever heard. It was the sound of loyalty. Comment, I remember the Huey, if that sound still lives in you. They didn't wait. Soldiers, some wounded themselves, ran from the tree line, dragging the non-ambulatory wounded. Other men ran to the helicopter, their arms loaded with cases of ammunition, grenades, and most precious of all, water. The exchange was frantic, a dance of desperation. Ammunition off, wounded on. Crandall never shut the engine down. He sat exposed, a target, as bullets peppered the air around him. His crew chiefs and gunners grabbed the wounded, pulling them in, stacking them on the floor of the cabin. There was no time for care. There was only time for speed. They were on the ground for less than a minute. Go! 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 Crandall pulled collective. The turbine screamed, protesting the weight. The ship felt heavy, sluggish. He eased it up, treetop level, and then nosed it forward, gaining speed, running the gauntlet of fire a second time to get out. He could feel the thuds of rounds hitting the belly of his aircraft. One of his crew chiefs was hit, but they were airborne. They raced back to the aid station at LZ Falcon, unloaded the wounded into the waiting arms of surgeons, and then they did the unthinkable. They turned around. They reloaded their ships with ammunition and water, and they went back. Not once, not twice. Major Bruce Crandall and Captain Ed Freeman flew into landing zone X-ray 14 times that day. 14 separate trips into a closed, overrun, apocalyptic landing zone. The battle did not stop for them. The NVA fighters saw these two ships, these two defiant machines, and concentrated their fire. They were flying through a solid wall of lead. On one trip, Crandall's ship was so badly damaged, he had to land it at the forward base and sprint to a backup helicopter. He didn't hesitate. He got in the new one and took off. His wingman, Freeman, took just as many hits. His ship, too, was a flying wreck. But they kept coming. Each trip was a psychological victory for the men on the ground. Each thwop, thwop, thwop was a hammer blow against the NVA's morale and a surge of adrenaline for the 107th. The wounded were disappearing from the aid station. The ammunition belts were being replenished on the line. The canteens were being filled. Men who were moments from death by dehydration could now fight. Men who were moments from being overrun now had the grenades to push the enemy back. Crandall and Freeman were not just pilots. They were a lifeline. They were the cavalry. They were bringing the one thing more important than bullets or water. They were bringing hope. They were proof that the men of the 107th Cavalry had not been forgotten. Inside the cockpit, it was a world of focused intensity. Crandall would later say he was too busy to be scared. This is the pilot's paradox. Fear is a luxury you cannot afford. You must focus on the task, the gauge, the sound of the engine, the voice of your wingman, the flicker of movement in the trees. It is a state of heightened consciousness, where time itself compresses and stretches. The 14 flights blur into one continuous act of will. The heat inside the bubble canopy was intense. The smell of jet fuel, cordite, and blood filled the cabin. The controls vibrated so hard his arms ached. But the sight that burned into his memory was the one he saw every time the doors opened on the ground. The faces of the wounded, young men, 18, 19 years old, covered in dust and gore, their eyes wide with shock. And the gratitude, the quiet nod from a soldier with a bandaged head, the hand that reached out to touch the skid of the helicopter as if to prove it was real. That was why he flew. He flew for them. He refused to leave because they were still there. He was upholding a sacred, unwritten law of the soldier. I will never leave a fallen comrade. By the end of the day, Crandall and Freeman had evacuated some 75 wounded men, 75 sons, brothers, and husbands who would see home again. And the hundreds of men still fighting on the ground had the means to keep fighting. The line held. The NVA, having taken staggering losses, finally pulled back. Landing Zone X-ray, against all odds, had survived. The 500 men had held their ground, in large part because one pilot and his wingman refused to accept that the sky was closed. The war, of course, did not end at Ia Drang. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. It was the first major battle between the U.S. Army and the regular forces of North Vietnam. It was the battle that taught both sides how the rest of the war would be fought. It proved the concept of air mobility. It proved the helicopter was the new cavalry steed. But it only worked. It only worked because of the men inside them. Men like Bruce Crandall and Ed Freeman. Their story is not one of glory. It is one of profound, gritty, stubborn loyalty. It is a story of ingenuity, using a simple transport ship as a lifeline in a way no manual had ever written. It is a story of courage, not the courage of a man who feels no fear, but the courage of a man who has a job to do, and whose sense of duty is stronger than his sense of survival. For his actions that day, Bruce Crandall was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. It would take nearly 42 years, 4 decades, for that award to be upgraded. In 2007, Major Bruce Crandall stood in the White House and was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest citation for valor. Captain Ed Freeman received his in 2001. The recognition was late, but the truth of that day was timeless. The medal was not for one act. It was for the 14th act. It was for the refusal. The refusal to be safe while others suffered. The refusal to obey an order that would have cost men their lives. The refusal to leave. War is a machine that breaks men. But this is a story about how sometimes men break the machine. They break its rules. They defy its logic of death. They remind us that even in the epicenter of chaos, human character is the force that matters most. The 500 men of the 107th Cavalry, who survived that inferno never forgot. They never forgot the heat, the thirst, or the fear. And they never forgot the sound that cut through it all. The battle ended. The war moved on. But for the men of the Ia Drang Valley, the sky will forever echo with the sound of a promise kept. If this story moved you, write below. We never forget.